I saw a desert with the most beautiful soil. This is hard to put into words since it was so drenched in feeling, but this soil was light brown, warm, and receptive. I saw 2 female feet walking on it. The feet were gentle, young, and beautiful, and around the left foot was a golden bracelet. There was a warm sunlight everywhere, and I saw that once a long time ago, the light of God came all the way down, penetrated the earth, and reflected the light back up, so people could remember God through their feet by walking the earth. And women were the ones who knew the secret of this remembrance. I knew that it was waiting to return, but that it was not yet time. There was not yet a space in the world. So that's a very personal experience of an awareness that something is happening now that has to do with God coming all the way down to earth, and a very personal interpretation of how she and women in general can participate in that experience. So I want to do a little bit of reading from the book and talking about some of the very specific powers that I go into. So I want to start a little bit with nourishment. And nourishment, not in the sense of, nourishment ultimately in the sense of spiritual nourishment. But I want to give you a very specific example of breastfeeding. Now, if you've ever breastfed a baby, you know it's not an easy task. It's not always pleasant. But if you talk to a woman, or if you yourself have had this experience, there's usually a very an intimate nature to the experience, a connection, love that's present, a sense of meaning in this experience. Now, ultimately, breastfeeding is a spiritual experience. We don't know it's a spiritual experience because we don't even value it as a physical experience. I mean, our world doesn't even encourage restaurants to have private spaces where women can breastfeed. We don't allow it so much in public spaces. We objectify the breast. We sexualize the breast. The breast has been co-opted by a patriarchal world. The actual capacity for a woman to nourish a child through her body alone is miraculous. And when you talk to women who've had this experience, often they will describe it as miraculous. So I want to read a quote from a grade school friend of mine, actually. She's from Seattle, and she's a mother. And I asked her about what breastfeeding was like for her. I grew up in a fairly religious but not particularly spiritual home. We had a strong sense of a religious identity and morals, but no true connection with God or higher power. When I had my first child, however, I was overwhelmed by the bond I felt with my daughter during breastfeeding. It wasn't just the physical connection. Giving life and nourishment to her and watching her grow over the weeks and months was miraculous. But what threw me was the emotional response. It was joy, wonder, devotion, and hope rolled into a connection shared only by the two of us. So she was having this experience while breastfeeding. And, sadly, because of how our culture does not respect breastfeeding, she didn't understand that actually it was a spiritual experience, and not only that it was a spiritual experience, but that it had ramifications beyond her child. I mean, there isn't even the opportunity to explore or be curious about the spiritual dimension of what she's experiencing here, because we have such a limited sense of what this experience is about. Nothing is reflected back to her that this is a spiritual experience. So when a child is weaned, many women will have this sadness, this sense of grief, because what is so intimate and so connecting and so engaged physically and requires such presence and sacrifice has no place in the world. There's no way for a woman to even think it could be anything but a very personal, temporal experience between her and her own child. So, in my interview with Dr. Sun, the Qigong teacher, he told me about chakras that are on women's breasts, that are active when you're breastfeeding. So, when the milk flows, the chakras turn, spin, and spiritual energy comes out of the breast with the milk and nourishes the child spiritually. Nourishes the life system of the child, not just the physical body. And as he explains, those chakras don't disappear when the child is grown up. They serve a spiritual function beyond child rearing. So you can, as a woman, use these chakras later in life, anytime, activate them, and that same energy comes out not to a child with the breast milk, but to the community of life, to the web of life, to what's an invisible, interconnected, spiritual web. Some cultures have a sense of this. So Saban Fusome describes the breast and how it's treated in her culture. The breast is a sacred source of energy that enables life to continue. In our tradition, the breast is used to welcome people and restore balance. Women in our tribe go topless, not as an invitation to intimacy, but to help the psyche receive what is life-giving. Men go off to war, and when they return, women will present their breasts as a way to say, "This is a sacred place that values life. You can release your negativity and live peacefully here." So in a tradition that understands the sacredness of a woman's body, there's just a natural expansion of this sense of the breast to have a community element, to have a capacity to actually transform other individuals and serve the community. So I want to read what Dr. Sun says about the chakras in the breast. Breastfeeding naturally activates the chakra, an energy point near a woman's breast, which allows energy to flow with the breast milk to the child. This helps the child grow just as much as the milk itself. This chakra works with the heart. It sustains the child, and it also protects the child. It can have a strong purple color, which indicates the energy of the lymphatic system and the spleen. So it's very practical in some sense. I want to read a quote from a woman in California who had a sense of what breastfeeding could teach her about life beyond, about nourishing beyond her child. My experience of breastfeeding showed me something so important. It was like an imprint on how much love and connection there can be when you don't put yourself first, when you're not at the center of the world. I never had a picture of myself as a sacrificing person, and it's not really accurate to call it that. It's more that you are just in it. So again, there's this template for nourishment about how women can nourish life that's activated when we're breastfeeding, but then needs a quality of attention and commitment later in order to be activated for another purpose. And I think it's important to understand that this is how spiritual energy and spirituality works. That it's a gift, for the most part, that we are given spiritual experiences and access to spiritual energy at various times of our lives, often for a very natural, simple participation in creation, or to make something happen in the physical world, just like taking care of a child. But then later it's gone. And then there's often a quality of grief or sadness at the loss of this gift, this love, this connection. And then what's required is this stepping away from oneself and being willing to participate in something beyond yourself and your own intimate experience. And so with all these powers, they become active when they're not just given. They become active when we want to and follow our longing to participate in something really meaningful in life beyond ourselves. And then there isn't a rule book on how to activate these chakras, for example, though I'm sure if you talk to Dr. Sun, he would have some tips. But it's this first step of knowing that they're there, and the second step of being willing to participate in nourishing something beyond yourself that won't give you such necessarily the immediate satisfaction or experience of breastfeeding a child, but nonetheless is sort of a deeper and more transcendent, less personal, transpersonal experience of connection with life.